You guys can go ahead.
Hi guys, how are you today?
Good. How are you, Kim?
Good. So Steve, I asked Steve to bring a map tonight to share with us to go over some comments that we received at the last public hearing, or the only public hearing that we had. So basically the comments surround the two parcels on Mason Montgomery Road and Montgomery Road. So those two pink areas that we deemed transitional in nature. We've had a lot of comments from that neighborhood that backs up to it, which is Montgomery Trace, which is in the yellow there. They are vehemently opposed to reclassifying that from residential to the transitional district. I've tried talking to many of the residents in the area, and they just don't want to budge off the residential. So I'm wondering how you guys all feel about that.
Okay, why do we want to move it away from residential?
We had talked about it being transitional because of the natures of the properties. It's basically, what is it, 2 houses on there, Steve, on Mason Montgomery, and 2 houses on Montgomery Road. So they're very small pieces of property, and you can't really, the only thing you really can do with it is put another house on it. Or you could use it as a transitional piece where I guess you could either do like a small apartment building, or you could do like
Townhouses or something like that.
condos or something like that.
Yeah.
I think when we decided to make it transitional, we did that with the intention that since both of those properties are facing Montgomery Road and Mason Road, rather than being part of that subdivision, that they would ultimately be used as retail, as along with other properties, adjoining properties potentially, or something else, but that it's really part of a strategy for Montgomery Road and or Mason Road, and not for that subdivision.
True.
So those 2 plots of land are not part of Montgomery Trace. They're separated from that rest of that community.
Correct.
So I could potentially pull up the aerial if that's helpful for folks.
Well, I'm just wondering, why did those get carved out when you build a development like that? So they just left those 2 plots and moved and built all around them?
They probably weren't sold. They didn't want to sell their land to the developer.
Okay. What did people on that property want?
We didn't hear from any of those people.
They're probably thinking, it's my house, it's my land. I don't even know why we're even having this conversation. Is that possible?
Probably.
It's more likely that they own and rent those houses possibly, or that they just didn't show up.
I think one of those properties, the southernmost on Montgomery Road, is vacant, isn't it? It's just a plot of land. Yeah, that one.
One of them is, yeah.
Yeah.
And we have the ability, regardless of what the owner wants, to be able to change the zoning on those plots of land, that private property,
This is just land use. This is not zoning.
or land use. We have that ability.
Yeah, the trustee, we can make the recommendation to the trustees, and the trustees can make that decision.
And remember, this doesn't change anything with zoning, and it doesn't change anything with regard to future development. It just basically provides a strategy for the township in regard to future development activity.
That's right.
So if somebody wanted to put commercial in that, they'd have to go forward and get a formal rezoning request approved.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I think the intent always here is to try to find a way to transition. In fact, that's in the land use category name, between the lower density subdivision that actually turns away from the busy roads, where these parcels actually front and face the busy roads, and either across the street or next door are things that are not single family. So in the planner mind, this is a way to move from lower density to slightly higher density, and this allows things like slightly higher density housing, or even, I think, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, like an office type use.
Right, that conversion of the houses to office or some kind of development like that, right? I mean, the question, the land use related question for this is those vacant properties on Montgomery Road, for example. Does the township actually expect anybody to build a single family house with a driveway coming off of Montgomery in the future on that vacant lot?
And I think our answer was no, and that's why we went with transitional.
Right. So, right, is single family a viable land use category? Is that actually what the township wants to be developed on that property, a new single family house coming out onto Montgomery?
So Brian, when we classify it as transitional, and let's say you own the property and you sell it to me, and I decide I want to build a house on it, do I need to do anything?
Nope.
Do I get a special permit?
Nope.
If I decide I want to put a store there?
Then you go through the full-blown zone change process.
Okay, all right, that's helpful.
Right, including all the public hearings and the township trustees' final decision.
So what in fact is land use, calling it transitional? What does that actually do? If you still have to go through all those processes, whether we call it residential or we call it transitional, what impact does that have to the citizens of Symmes Township?
So the Regional Planning Commission has bylaws that require them to be consistent with the adopted land use plan. And the staff report that's prepared by the county staff for the zone change is a Regional Planning Commission staff report. So our recommendation at the Regional Planning Commission is consistent with the adopted land use plan as well. So for example, if the land use plan says single family and somebody wanted to convert that house to an office use, we would look at the land use plan, see it says single family, and we would recommend denial of the development no matter what it was, no matter if everybody loved it or if it was terrible development or a great development. We would recommend denial because the land use plan shows single family and the development of office wouldn't be consistent with that. The Regional Planning Commission will also likely recommend denial of the zone change request as well because it's not consistent with the land use plan, and their bylaws require them to be consistent with the land use plan. At that point, it would get to the Township Zoning Commission and go to the Township Trustees. Neither of those boards have bylaws or requirements to be consistent with the plan. The only issue is the defensibility of their decision based on the fact that they have an adopted comprehensive plan that says that they want X in the future. In that example, if the land use plan says they want single family in the future and it was adopted this year and it was current and had been recently reviewed and the township still said single family, then none of those other developments would be consistent with the land use plan, and the defensibility of the township's position to potentially deny a zone change would be less. Not that they wouldn't be able to deny a zone change. It would just be less based on the fact that the owner could say, well, not the owner could say, but the neighbors could say, the land use plan says single family, so you have to deny this.
Right. So by designating it transitional, what we've done is we've opened up the possibilities for other options, but we've not closed off any options. It could still be residential or it could go commercial, but by designating it transitional, we've taken it out of the hands of the regional board zoning group that would have to say, no, it's land use is residential, it has to be residential. By saying it's transitional, we give the people some options in terms of how to utilize the land that they don't have today, it being residentially zoned.
Correct, but the transitional category does close off some options still.
Such as?
Steve, what actual category is that? Transitional mixed use? You're still muted, Steve.
Transitional mixed use, yes. So it's this kind of peachish land use color.
So what transitional mixed use eliminates as a possibility would be retail or industrial development. So light industrial development or commercial retail development would not be allowed there. So like a Walgreens or a corner store or some kind of drive-through or something like that, those would all not be consistent with the land use plan, even with the transitional mixed use. What transitional mixed use allows for is single family, some multifamily, and some low intensity office uses.
Okay.
Three of those.
All right. Like a doctor's office or something.
Right. Like a standalone doctor's office or a conversion of the house to office. Yes.
Got it. Okay. Very helpful. Really good. Thank you.
How big are those parcels? Do we know?
At least half an acre or more.
Okay, so you have
The two properties are at least an acre. The two areas are at least an acre.
about an acre each.
Probably a little bit bigger, but yeah, around an acre each.
Okay. This is Byron. I got a little lost in what Brian was saying to Jack. Jack's now got it and I've lost it. What I don't understand is it seemed to me that the plan is advisory in nature. And it, as you said earlier, it doesn't set zoning for anything. And so regardless of whether you call it mixed use transitional or whether you call it industrial or anything on the plan, the zoning for those sites, those parcels right now, I assume is single family residential. And any attempt to change that zoning has to go through the trustees and they have to approve a zoning change. And here's the point that I'm trying to make or understand is no matter what the classification on the mixed use plan is, the trustees in their judgment after a public hearing can change the zoning to whatever the landowner wants to change it to or not in their judgment. And I thought what I heard in one of our meetings early about this was that, yeah, that's right. At least that's what I thought I was told. And that this is advisory in nature, but it gives the trustees a presumption, almost a rebuttable presumption to use legal terms, that says this is what the community wants to and is going toward. And so if the plan is favoring something and the owner wants to change it consistent with that plan, a zoning change consistent with that plan, it makes it easier for them to say, in our rationale and judgment, we should support and approve this. And if it doesn't, if it's inconsistent, they can say it's inconsistent with the plan. And while you have current zoning, we don't think it's the way the community is going. And in our judgment, we should disallow it. But it doesn't bind their votes. They can vote however they choose. They can change the zoning however they choose. And the plan for that purpose binds nothing. That's my point and my question. Am I right about that?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, I'm going to be the devil's advocate here a little bit. You have all those other pieces of property that are on, let's say, Mason Road, and they decide to sell to somebody that wants to build offices back there. And we've already changed the two parcels to a small office building as a zoning change. Now, since we've made that change, or the commission made that change, or allowed the building to be done, the offices to be done, what prevents them from making every piece of property along Mason Road to become an office building of some kind?
Well, the land use plan doesn't call for that. And currently the difference between the properties that front on Montgomery Road is that all the other properties you're talking about back up to Montgomery Road. So their access is off of a subdivision cul-de-sac street. They've got houses on them that back to Mason Road. And so the character of those properties is completely different than the two that front on Mason Road. So that's why you have a land use plan. You call for things that are set up to be single family, and things that aren't set up to be single family anymore to be something else. And that's
Right.
so when somebody came in and said they want to take the last 2 lots on that cul-de-sac and change them to an office because they're adjacent to an office zone, that's where the land use plan would come in, and the trustees would be able to point to the land use plan and say, we did not anticipate or desire to see those cul-de-sac lots go to office. That's why we didn't, or to go to some other transitional use. That's why we didn't land use plan for that.
But since I've lived in Symmes Township, I have not seen the, when it went up for a vote and everything, I've never seen them back down and say, no, you can't do it.
To the
When it came,
trustees,
the trustees, when it came to changes.
I have.
See, I haven't. I don't.
I've never lived in Symmes Township, and I've seen them deny zone changes.
Yeah.
Well, this is Byron again. Let me sort of suggest a more pragmatic approach to this that can be taken. One, the analysis, as I was part of the discussions on this, when we got to where we are at the moment, you look at the one on Montgomery Road. There is not a single family house south of there until you get literally to the subdivision, Calumet Farms. It's all kind of commercial, church, that big investment building. It's not really a residential area. It's also directly across the street from a commercial building, which, as I understand it, is empty. And just to the north of it is that dental clinic and that strip shopping center, even on both sides, strip shopping center. So at the time I was thinking, okay, it makes sense. Admittedly, none of the owners were there. None of the owners asked for this. And that's really my final point about this, is that bears on the discussion we're having. The thought on our part was, when we sort of suggested this, was I can't imagine someone who owns that house selling it and the buyer wanting to live in it as a single family house. And then someone else mentioned the ones on Mason Road, which are directly across from that very commercial facility. They face out onto Mason Road in a very commercial outlook. Who's going to want to buy a house that looks across at nothing but a commercial environment? So, and a highly trafficked one. So that is how we got to the point of saying, let's change the plan on these properties for the benefit of those landowners who are not there and did not ask for this. So now you have a subdivision that says, we don't want that. It ruins the ambiance of our community. And that's a valid point on their part, to the exclusion of the actual owners of those properties. But when you put it in the perspective of what the township trustees are, and now suddenly the political sensitivity of this, and I'm relying on Kim for the fact that she says many people have raised this point. I don't have a clue as to how many, but if they're really opposed to it, one, we're not binding anybody. We don't really need to raise this ruckus. When these owners want to change zoning and sell it to somebody for a commercial use or even a single family use, they wouldn't have to change zoning. When they want to change it, they can face that with the trustees at the time, and the decision won't bind them. We don't have to make this change. Making this change is going to cause some minor community upset that is totally unnecessary at this point, because we're strictly advisory in nature. So whatever judgment you make is, one, the owners haven't asked for it, and there's some community resistance to it that is unnecessary at this point and can be addressed when it is an issue, when somebody wants to build something else and change the zoning. I'm not advocating one or the other. I was kind of for doing these owners a favor on a planning basis of what made sense. But I don't live in that community, and the owners haven't asked for it. So I'm indifferent about it. And I can see a politician saying, we don't have to cross this bridge today.
So that's true. So the comprehensive planning, or the planner's kind of rebuttal to that is, the good land use planning doesn't necessarily require or rely on the approval or consent of either the property owners or the neighbors. If it makes good land use planning sense, then that's what a land use plan update should do, is make those decisions, because maybe those hard decisions that this plan doesn't make sense for these properties and we recommend something else, even if that's upsetting a neighborhood or wasn't requested by the property owners. Because that's the point of a comprehensive long-range plan, is not to consider the existing property owners or the arguments that they're making now, which would be part of a zone change public hearing discussion. It's just whether or not that land use makes sense on those properties.
I agree 100%, and that's how I would vote in this situation. I'm just pointing out for everybody that, one, the owners haven't asked for it, and two, there's opposition that's maybe perhaps politically unnecessary. But strictly from the land use planning perspective, it makes perfect sense to me, and I would be supportive of it. But I can also understand dropping it because people don't want to face that problem now. Never mind, apparently the process we're going through is we're just making a recommendation to the trustees, and they're going to adopt the plan or not. And so it's really their call, and we can recommend this or not recommend it. We can change the plan we recommend. Either way, we don't have, this is not something we should fall on our swords over either way.
I agree with you, Byron. I think that these properties are not, in spite of the fact that when you look at all of that, that yellow and the roads that are adjacent to it, I mean, these are not parcels that are in that subdivision. They're parcels that are excluded. There's no way to get to them from that subdivision. They're specifically excluded from that subdivision. So I think that, you have to look at it with an eye to their frontage roads and not to what's behind them.
I kind of share that viewpoint. I'm looking at it in terms of where's the community going?
Right.
Across the street on Montgomery Road, and all sides of it, those houses are blocked by commercial stuff. Same thing with the one on Mason Road, faces directly into a big commercial area with commercial parking and commercial activity, and they're not part of a subdivision community.
Right.
But we have to recognize that our trustees are sensitive to political pressures too. But we're just recommenders.
Yeah.
Okay, so after all of that, Byron, what was your conclusion?
My conclusion is, on a purely planning basis, I agree with Brian Snyder. These locations have a different future than single family housing.
Potentially.
Yes.
Because I mean, I'm looking at it from a satellite standpoint. There's no reason why somebody couldn't buy that and put a house in there.
Oh,
And
no,
the
there are houses that there are.
Yeah,
houses,
So I if you want to do a tear down and replace it.
Yeah, but the practicality of that, Jack, is I think limited, because nobody's going to want to, that doesn't make sense to live on Montgomery Road when.
That one does, but the other one's already got driveways onto Mason Road, and you got two houses there. So
you could also get someone coming from a big city, and to them, that's not a big deal.
Yeah.
That they would buy the two pieces of parcel and put up a house.
My personal analysis was, when the families that live there, assuming they are homeowners, when they pass away, who's going to buy their house? Who wants to pull out onto Montgomery Road every morning on the way to work and deal with all the traffic passing by? And the same thing with Mason Road. I'm a bus rider, and if you go down Mason Road closer to where it gets to Montgomery Road is the parking lot where I park to get on the bus in the morning and get off in the afternoon. I'm telling you right now, the park and ride on the opposite the church side, the side where that investment firm is, I park in there, and when I get off the bus going north, I can't cross the street because the traffic is so constant coming down Mason Montgomery Road to Montgomery. If I lived and I I wouldn't be able to pick the houses out on Mason Road if I had to, but I just assume they're there and I understand sort of what the layout is. They get that same traffic. And I wouldn't want to buy a house that had to pull out onto that traffic on either one of those roads. That was the mindset I was having. Who's going to buy this senior citizens couple who've gone to a retirement home or passed away? Who's going to want to buy that as a single family house?
Sure.
It doesn't really matter though, because if as Ralph said, somebody, moves in from New York City and says, hey, this is beautiful, tranquil suburbia, I'll buy that house. They can. There's nothing that would prohibit them from buying that property and putting up the biggest house that property will allow, without any changing to zoning, because it's already zoned, in our transitional description, you can put up a single family home.
Oh, absolutely. Even if it was zoned commercial, you can do that. Again, this is a different perspective on how you approach these things. In the real estate world and appraisals, it's all about highest and best use. If I'm looking at either one of those parcels and I want to open a dental office, I'd buy those to open a dental office. I wouldn't put a light industrial in there, but I'd certainly put a dental office or a realtor's office or something like that. If you're the owner, you want to sell it to get the highest and best use. That's just a mindset. I'm not trying to advocate you guys how to vote or how you want to go with this. I'm just trying to give you a different perspective about how people look at this from the commercial business world, let alone the planning world.
Kim, let me build on a point that I think Byron made earlier is from a political standpoint. If we, as this subgroup, recommend transitional and it goes to the trustees, are they obligated to do anything with this, or is this a file note that goes into the file for future use?
They could consider your recommendations, or they could make changes of their own.
Okay, and if we said we want to make this transitional, how is that going to sit with the community?
I think the only people that have expressed concern is the Montgomery Trace subdivision. And we did have some people from right in that area that Steve's showing now. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Right back there from the condos.
That area there was about a different parcel. It wasn't about these two parcels.
You're right. It was more about the vacant parcels that are right next door to them. I think they were confused and
they were so hot and bothered at that meeting that we dropped that issue then.
It wasn't.
Well, we
that
didn't.
We were upset about the potential for family homes going into the property at the entrance to their development, which doesn't matter what the land use plan or the zoning says.
Okay, so if the Board of Trustees gets a recommendation for us to zone these two or to call these two transitional, are they obligated to do anything, or could they just, as I said, put it in a file and note it and wait to see if anything develops in a year, 5 or 10 years from now?
Well, no, they're going to approve the land use plan.
Okay.
But they could make changes of their own as they approve it. So we've made a lot of changes or a lot of recommendations for changes throughout the whole entire map. So they could either accept all of our changes, or they could make changes of their own, or they could say, we're going to accept 90% of these, but these two over here, we're not going to agree with, and we're going to leave these residential.
Would they have that discussion with us so we understand their rationale, or are we just handing it off and then they do whatever they want to do?
You're going to hand it off, and then Brian's going to take it, and Steve is going to take it, and they're going to take it to regional planning, and they're going to get a recommendation, and then they're going to take it to the zoning commission, and they're going to get a recommendation, and then it's going to go to the trustees for their recommendation.
Well, no.
No, it doesn't go to the whole process?
No, because that's like a zone change. This goes to the trustees, and then the trustees adopt it and make a recommendation for the planning commission to adopt it.
Okay.
It goes to the planning commission.
Oh, so it goes to us first and then planning commission?
Correct, that's right.
Okay.
So given the fact that they've empowered us to go ahead and do this study and come up with these recommendations, what is the probability that they're going to look at it and come back Brian, from your experiences, and nickel and dime certain parcels, and I think that ought to be commercial instead of residential and all that stuff. Does that happen, or do they just kind of say, thank you very much, we'll accept your recommendation and move on?
I can't speak for this board of trustees. That depends on the board of trustees.
Plus, it's also going to depend, Jack, too, because we're going to have a public hearing at the trustees meeting, and they're going to hear from all the residents that want to come in and say their piece.
Do we really care? I mean, other than the fact that, I'd like to take care of you, Kim and Phil, and, avoid you having to listen to residents harangue you. But we've given you what our best counsel and advice is, which is what you've asked us to do. The political implications of that should not really sway us one way or another. We should make the best recommendation we can, and then let the chips fall where they may with the trustees.
Well, I agree with you, Jeff. I mean, that was what your job was to make recommendations the best way you see fit. And I think that's what Brian said at the very beginning, is that a good land use plan does all those things.
Can I say something?
Sure, go ahead, Dima.
So I was thinking the other way. If people actually want to keep these as residential land use, because I understand it's a residential neighborhood, and this might affect the value of their neighborhood depending on what kind of business or use comes into this area. Why don't we think the other way? And if we want to keep these residential, help the environment around it to make it residential. So we do not want to back out to busy Montgomery Road. I have seen, like, if you go to downtown Montgomery by Kroger, there's a stretch, I think, right across the cemetery where there were like those old houses. They're like demolishing those houses and building off the street like a couple houses on each lot. The only difference in the landscape or the streetscape is that they have a median of trees. So maybe if we put a median on Mason and on Montgomery Road, right, like around these areas, maybe that would help maintain those plots be actually usable residential lots. I don't know how realistic and how embedded this is. Like, I mean, this is streetscape, so I don't know if this is relevant or not, but this is from a design perspective.
It's not a bad idea, but the only problem is Mason Montgomery Road is a county road. It's not a township road.
Montgomery Road's a state road, isn't it?
Montgomery Road is true, yes.
Yeah.
22-3, but Mason Montgomery Road is a town or a county road.
So the process today, what do we do? Do we take a vote, or what do we do to kind of get this to the point where you're ready for the next step?
I guess the committee needs to just tell us, are they okay leaving it transitional, or should we change it?
Right, and I think, Steve, you said the ground rules that we had at the beginning were try and build consensus, but that a vote of the committee members was kind of the last resort if consensus couldn't be built.
Oh, right.
That's correct. So we're trying to find something that everyone can live with, right? I mean, that's the definition of consensus for me. So it might not be perfect, but everyone's like, yeah, I can go to sleep tonight and be okay.
So Steve, if I understand this correctly, which is a little different than what I think Kim just said, currently they're residential. If we did nothing, they stay residential. If we make it a proposal to move it transitional, that is what we need to agree to say, yeah, we're all in agreement, consensus, move it to transitional. Is that correct?
Well, again, I think you can look at this two ways, right? So the current proposal shows them transitional. So are we saying, wow, we heard a bunch at the open house that people don't want that transitional. So is our consensus to leave the map as presented at the open house, or to change the map back in those 4 parcel instances to what it currently is?
Which is?
The single family.
Single family, okay.
Kim, have we heard from the actual property owners what their desires may or may not be?
No, I never had or heard any or have any contact with the homeowners. I've just been talking to the HOA from Montgomery Trace, and they have been getting comments from their whole collective neighborhood about those particular parcels, and they're the ones that have expressed all their concerns, but not the owners of those parcels themselves.
And are there concerns specific to like a commercial development that they don't know which business that may or may not be, or are they concerned about townhomes and just too much congestion and traffic, or what sort of concerns did they raise?
It was all of the above, and they want it to be just like their neighborhood. So they'd rather it just be one single family house, just like their neighborhood is. But I did caution them that those parcels are big enough where they could actually come in and squish a bunch of houses on them.
Right.
If it does be, if they leave it single family residential, there is potential. If that's, I don't know, what is that, about 2 acres in size, Steve?
So they're about 1.5 acres each. So it's about 3 total.
Okay, so 3 acres. So what is it, 20,000 square foot lots? So you could potentially put 4, 5, 6 houses back there, and they could just squish them all on there.
Mhm.
So I did warn I did tell the residents that, that could be a potential issue that would come up. So that's why I thought that it might be better off if you just put an office building there, and at least there would be buffering and screening and things like that when it went for, the plan review. But when you're just doing a subdivision, you get none of that.
So if somebody bought those 2 properties and decided to parcel them out into 5, is there a zoning permit that they have to get? Would there be a public hearing, or is that just done by submitting and paying a fee and getting it redone?
Yeah, they would just go to Steve. They would submit it to Steve and go through the subdivision process.
So the people in Montgomery Trace wouldn't even know about it until the bulldozers show up and start clearing it.
Yep.
Okay. Well, that's interesting to know.
Yep, as long as it meets zoning and they have enough frontage for all the lots. I mean, look at how you can tell with all the different neighborhoods around there, especially when you get to the very ends of some of these neighborhoods where they've squished a bunch of panhandle lots in.
Well, you can
Same
see
concept.
from the Montgomery Trace that is four current properties that butt up against the back side. So you could easily probably break that into 4 separate housing.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And again, making it transitional does not preclude you from doing that. Is that correct?
That's
Right, you
right.
could still do residential on it, right, Steve?
Okay.
Yeah.
So you can go either way in a transitional. Okay, so that gives you a little bit more flexibility. What I'm trying to do is trying to understand what's the compelling reason for us to make a recommendation to go to transitional that would make sense for the Board of Trustees to be able to face their constituents and be able to explain it to them by saying, hey, by going transitional, you have some additional options that you don't have if you just keep it strictly residential. And there are some nightmare scenarios or there's no scenarios. Those 2 houses sell and the people live in them and life goes on.
So if I were living in that neighborhood, if my property backed up to, say, the one on Montgomery I'm looking at, across from Enyart, I mean, it's one thing if, like Kim says, there's buffering, say it becomes a doctor's office. It's a small 1-story commercial use that's very tastefully done. But how could we can't really guarantee that to those neighbors that back up to it. It could just as easily be a Jiffy Lube, right?
No, it can't be a
No.
Jiffy Lube because that's commercial.
Okay, well, I picked a bad example then, but it could be something,
An office use. It could be office, or it could be a condo, or it could be
A dog
residential.
kennel?
That's funny. Dog kennels are agricultural uses. They're allowed anywhere. They're
Oh,
exempt by state law.
Lovely.
You brought up a really interesting example. Jack?
Could I put a 7-story garage and office building there?
Not anything 7 stories, no.
So I think it's what, 35 feet is the height restriction?
Yep.
That's two.
For houses or for commercial, I mean, for office. Office, multifamily, single family height restrictions are the same. When they abut single family like that, yeah.
Can it be multifamily?
Transitional
have-
residence would allow it to be, yeah.
But it would be like lower density multifamily, correct?
Right, so this is what you would, as the trustees, you would have, I mean, the trustees would have this ability to look at the character of the surrounding area when considering a zone change. It's one of the things that the trustees always consider for every zone change. If you're surrounded by commercial shopping malls, it's hard for you to say that a flat roof, 2-story commercial building is not okay. But if you're surrounded by pitched roof, single family houses and other residential looking office buildings, for the trustees to say, we want you to look just like that, that's very defensible, and it's often occurred in other zone changes in Symmes Township. So you got that, and the same with the multifamily scenario. If you tried to do something that's like 30 units to the acre on a couple acres in between a bunch of 20,000 square foot lots, you'd say that's inconsistent with the character of the area. It doesn't fit with the density of the surrounding area, and you would deny that zone change. Both of those are legally defensible reasons to either alter or deny a zone change request. What's questionable legally is requiring somebody to maintain single family zoning onto a state route like Montgomery Road. I think somebody brought up the compelling interest on why you would change the zoning. So if your land use plan is calling for something that everybody knows is not feasible, it's not generally something that's going to happen, a lawyer will argue or could argue that that land use plan and that current zoning is unconstitutional, that use that you're requesting and that you're requiring them to do through zoning and that you're suggesting they do in the future through land use planning is unconstitutional because it's not realistic that that would ever be built. And I think somebody brought up the highest and best use. That's also a zoning argument that lawyers use to have zone changes approved that were denied by the jurisdiction because they should be allowed to have the highest and best use on the property. And at the very least, your land use plan and zoning shouldn't be a taking of their property rights. And expecting them to build new single family houses on Montgomery Road is something a lawyer would walk into a court and argue and take pictures of the character of Montgomery Road. They would point out the things that we've already pointed out, that there are no other single family houses in this area that front onto Montgomery Road. And that requiring them to build new houses that come onto Montgomery Road is not constitutional. And that would be irrespective of what the township trustees did. The owner could make that argument to court, could appeal the trustee's decision, and the court judge could approve that because the judge doesn't care about the politics of it. The judge will look at whether or not it makes sense generally. And often the court side on the side of the developer. So
Brian, that was really, really helpful. I think at this point for me, I'm okay with it being transitional. I would support that recommendation.
I would too.
Is there anyone that wouldn't?
I think it's inevitable. That's my opinion. I mean, it's,
You know,
the land use is showing the proper use of the property, or at least where it's moving towards. I'm just trying to understand what the concerns were for the adjacent residents. I just, personally, I don't understand them. That's why I'm curious about it.
well, if I was one of them that backed up, I would say my property value would go down immensely.
Yeah,
I
and
thought
I
it
think
would go
they use
up.
that.
I mean, if my property backed up and I had a $500,000 house in there, I would tell them and probably be able to prove it that my house now lost $150,000 or more.
you know, I've heard that argument for every zone change that I've been involved with for the last 20 years, and I've never once had anybody been able to prove that to me. Even years later, you can't prove it. It doesn't happen. It generally doesn't happen. It's an argument has very little weight and is unprovable. It sounds good and it makes people concerned. They can tell it to their neighbors. They all get together and agree that that's a problem. but generally it doesn't actually happen and nobody can prove that it does.
If you get your house evaluated and that becomes that piece of parcel becomes a non-residential parcel, and I backed up to it, my house would, and I would get it evaluated for that, and then ask the township or somebody to give me my money.
They don't evaluate houses based on what's next to them. They evaluate houses based on the sales of
Comps.
comparable properties in the area.
It's the
It's like
comps,
I said,
and that piece of parcel is a comp. It's
People
usually a
are
quarter mile. It's
And
a
it'll
quarter
sell for a
mile.
lot more. It'll sell for a lot more as commercial than it will for single family. If people have tried to prove this argument over and over again for every, like I said, for every zone change in the last 20 years that I've dealt with, it's butted up to residential. Everybody said it. People have tried to prove it, but nobody's actually been able to prove it because it generally just doesn't happen.
Well,
This
let
is-
me interrupt and play lawyer again for a second. In my mind, the way property law works and the way constitutional law works in conjunction with that is you can't control my property for the benefit of your own. The community can control property to some extent without impinging on the constitutional rights of the individual landowner. You can take property for just compensation, but you can't, while it may be true, what someone else does with their property, your neighbor, can impact the commercial value or simply the value of your property, but that doesn't mean you can stop them from doing what they want to do with their own property in light of the existing laws. And we're not doing a zoning, we're not doing a law, we're doing a plan that is administrative in nature. So while it's true that everybody in that Montgomery Trace subdivision may have their property values impacted by the commercial development around them, including the commercial development that already is around them, they can't tell some other property owner in that neighborhood or the adjacent neighborhood, these parcels we're talking about, what they can do with their own property. So Ralph's got a point, it impacts their values, but that's irrelevant to an individual property owner's own rights.
That is true. And, but if it stayed residential, then my property values may not be changed. If it goes transitional, it all depends on what goes on there, what could happen to my value. But I could see those parcels maybe not going to a business. I see it going to maybe putting 6 condos on that piece of on both of those parcels. Someone buying it and building 6 condos on there. So. And that won't bother me if it was condos as much as if it became a business of some kind.
All right, we've kicked this one good, 55 minutes.
We could kick it around for another 5.
Can we just take a vote?
Well, there's a couple other ones that I wanted to just call out to make sure we're on the same page. So
Oh, really?
I want to have time for that. So I'd rather than vote, I'd rather say, it sounds like we heard from 3 folks that can live with this or are supportive with the current version of the proposed map. Dima, are you okay with this? And Ralph, it sounded like you had some concerns there. Are you okay? Can you live with this? Can you sleep tonight?
I can live with it as going down the road. Today I don't know if I can live with it, but going down the road as a proposed use, possibly, yeah, I can live with it.
Well, and that's what a good land use plan does, though, by Ralph. We're looking into the future.
I know, and I understand that. I said, like, right now, I don't know if I can live with it, but down the road, I know it's probably going to happen, at least down along Montgomery Road. Mason Road, I'm not so sure about, but Montgomery Road, definitely.
Phil, how are you sitting?
Like I said, I think it's inevitable. I was for it in the first place. Again, I'm trying to put myself in the position of the adjacent landowners and what their concerns were. You know, if it's, as somebody said before, if it's done right, it could be, I mean, it would be much nicer than it currently is. I mean, it's just sort of vacant, bushy, scrubby areas right now. And it could be something very, very nice if it's done the right way.
Right.
Well, the interesting thing about that comment is that's exactly what you'll face when you're doing a rezoning, when there's a proposal and a plan by the landowner.
Mhm.
And right now we're just, speaking in the blind.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, I'm playing devil's advocate. If I lived right there, I would have a problem. But, it's inevitable. Eventually it's going to change. So, I mean, I can make it, in my mind, I could see it happening. So,
Well, that sort of gives a question for Kim again in her discussions with the people in that subdivision. The question I have is, do they fully understand this is simply a plan? It's not something changing the zoning today, not something binding on the property. It's an administrative tool for the trustees.
I have tried to explain that, but it's very difficult if you're not in our realm.
Yeah.
Me, Steve, and Brian were all trained. This is what we did for a living, or they still do for a living, and I kind of do it up for a living on the side, with their help. But it's hard to explain to people the whole process. They don't understand. They go right to, nope, this is zoning. And no, this is a land use plan where you make decisions and you make your zoning decisions based on your land use plan. So a lot of people have a hard time trying to differentiate between the two plans and understanding how they interrelate with each other. So I have tried to explain that. I've talked to the HOA. I have tried to, talk to some of the residents that have called, but some people tell you they understand, but I don't think they really do. But I don't know. I can't speak for the whole entire neighborhood.
Well, Kim, there's some times where you just got to tell people, I can explain it to you, but I can't understand it for you.
Yeah.
And just move on. I mean,
Yeah, it's a hard thing. It really is, especially if you're not used to it, especially if you do marketing for a living. I mean, you're just not it's not something you interact with. Most people don't even know what zoning is. So.
I mean, in reality, the two spaces on Montgomery Road, on Mason Road, is going to hit roughly 16 parcels, roughly.
Right.
And
yeah, but don't we just say, we'll worry about it when it comes up, and that's down the road? I mean, at this point right now, we're doing a lot of what ifs, but the reality is all we've done is given those properties additional flexibility. And until a proposal actually comes, a lot of the discussions that we're having are still in the future.
Correct.
So, I mean, at this point, can we move on? Can we say, all right, transitional and move on? And then when the time comes, we'll be involved in a certain way to answer these questions for real.
I'm fine to move on
Cool.
at this point.
Excellent. Well, it's a real good discussion. And these are not simple ones, right? These are not right at the edge of an expanding commercial area. They are kind of wrapped around a bit. So I get kind of working these through, because it's not a slam dunk where we see in some other townships where it's like, well, this is at the end of a commercial strip. It's the next parcel to go. We're going to put it transition, pretty slam dunk. All right. So the other one I was concerned about or heard about at the open house was the park, Seven Gables down here.
Yep. Yeah.
We put that into mixed use. And I think that was just a mistake, because I think the township owns that parcel, and I don't think there's any plans to develop it. I think it probably is meant to go back to the public institutional green, light green color. So that was something I thought we needed to clean up.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
I agree. That should have been green then.
But I'm assuming that's just the park portion, not the investment building.
Correct. For south of this line, this parcel line.
Yeah, that would be appropriate.
Yes. And then, you got some active citizens here in the Gable Glen area, and they showed up. And I think, Brian, you were saying that they're continuing to be concerned about these couple parcels at the front of their development.
Yeah, they sure were.
That's right.
And that we have not changed the land use on that. That's the same land use it was in the version that is current today.
Correct.
So unless they're advocating to kind of quote lower the intensity there, I guess that's what they were saying. But
So the property is zoned O office. It's zoned office currently.
All of that area is?
All 5 of those lots that they're concerned about is zoned office, right?
And how about Gable Glen? That's office too, isn't it?
That's multifamily, planned multifamily.
Same color though.
With different land use.
Yeah.
than zoning. I'm talking about the zoning of the
Plan,
property.
yeah,
is
plan
office.
versus zoning.
And the multifamily for the condos. So the land use plan says multifamily. It's already more restrictive than the zoning that's on the property.
Oh, okay.
No matter what land use we show on this plan, it won't address their concerns.
Okay. Now, since we're at it, just explain to me again what this plan characteristic is of the currently of the park and the investment building, and particularly what the impact is for the church across the street. What does this do to the church? It was previously in the plan, I think, single family residential, and it created some kind of problem, so we changed it to something. And I'm trying to understand.
I don't think so. I think the part of the church itself was land use plan for some kind of institutional. And
Okay.
the discussion was that everything that fronts on Montgomery Road should be something other than single family or institutional.
Exactly.
Right. So that's why it changed. It didn't change from single family, even though the church is zoned single family.
Yeah, you can't, we're not touching the zoning.
Right. So it's just changing the land use plan to make it consistent on that side of Mason Road with the Porter Financial Building.
Okay, good. That I just wanted to be fair and as supportive as we can for the church.
Yeah, it doesn't change the situation for the church. They're still zoned single family and they're allowed there as a conditional use.
Okay.
and then the last piece, since we're on Gable Glen, would be these couple parcels kind of behind it, down that hill in that little valley down there. I guess there's one single family house off that driveway that comes through here. We went ahead and threw them into this large group of planned mixed use. I don't see how that would impact these folks either. It's down pretty low in through there. I don't know.
This is near that creek and all?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's why they're not really sold or anything.
Right.
Yeah, I didn't hear anybody say anything about that at the open house though.
No.
I mean, I don't mind keeping it the way we have it marked, because it just combines it all into one. And where Gable Glens is, I mean, that's the parcels right now. So it fits right in there. I just don't like having little sporadic spaces popping up. That's a big thing to me, but.
Right. So for me, it's just that little visual that I think Kim has to deal with. Is it looks kind of like Gable Glen is surrounded by this different use. But I think we've got a well thought out rationale for why that is the case.
Yeah. On Montgomery Road in Seven Gables, where Symmes Township owns that parcel, doesn't it go all the way down to where Seven Gables runs into Montgomery Road? Don't they own all of that, or is that something else in that little quadrant?
Let me check. I've got case online.
Isn't it a big gully?
Yeah.
It is a big gully and that's
It
all.
might just be right away, Byron or
Yeah.
Ralph.
Yeah, that's, I didn't know I remember it's a big gully there. I'm just,
Yeah, because it really drops off.
yeah. That's why I'm saying, because I know there's forest behind that park area.
Hmm.
There's transmission lines in that area too, so I'm not sure if that's actually a Duke easement.
Sorry, take me a sec.
I'm just wondering if we noted as something else, that's all.
Well, maybe we ought to get to some kind of resolution here.
Yep.
Dima
So-
hasn't said anything for quite a while. Do you have an opinion, Dima?
No, I'm good.
Okay.
So I just got Cages Online up, and that parcel is actually tied to the parcel across the street, across Montgomery Road.
Oh,
Is it really?
So,
Oh, when they relocated Montgomery Road?
yeah, so that's Jonathan Murphy, Jonathan and Vicky Murphy.
Hmm.
And if you know how that parcel works, it is low because the creek kind of flows right.
yeah.
Right through there.
Okay.
I'm okay with the way we have it. I mean, you make that little
too.
change on
Yeah.
the use for the park and I'm ready to go.
Yep.
Me too.
Great. So that means we have a little work just to clean up these maps and then get those to Kim, along with the updated report, the document. You know, we didn't make many changes to that. That was a very light touch update to the document as per the contract. And then I guess we're ready to go in front of the trustees.
Okay.
Kim, maybe we should talk offline on logistics. Jason does a great job with ICRC. I assume that's how you guys are rolling right now with trustees meetings.
Well, we've done some with, yeah, ICRC has been doing a live broadcast for us on YouTube. And then we actually have the ability to do, take comments. So I might have to talk to Jason more about how that would work if we did something like this. Like if we decided, you know, if this quarantine still doesn't lift and we're all still not being able to be with each other, you know, that we may have to do something like that.
Great. Well, so we'll get together on timing on all that.
Okay.
I guess the request would be as many of the land use plan committee members who could make it to that meeting would be helpful, just a show of support and show that, yes, there was this group of volunteer committee members that came up with these recommendations.
When do you anticipate that roughly? Are we talking 3 weeks or 6 weeks or what?
Well, we'd have to advertise for it. So, and typically, well.
So middle of
how long-
June.
I was thinking more like July. That way it gives
Okay.
Steve time to get his document together and get the final map together, and it gives us time to advertise, and hopefully it gives us some, you know, space to get past all this quarantine, and that we can actually hold it at the safety center. And then we could actually spread people out if, you know, need be.
Terrific. Good. That sounds right.
But, you know, if we have to push it to August because of it, then we can, or we just figure out how to do it online.
Okay. Thank you.
That sounds like a plan.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's good to see you all, and thanks again for all your effort on this plan and taking real time to think it through. You know, again, that might contrast a little bit to some of our other communities who sometimes take a fast approach to some of these, and it's affecting people's lives and definitely affecting those property owners. So I appreciate your taking it with some seriousness and some thought.
Thank you, Steve and Brian, for leading us through the effort, and Kim for orchestrating everything, and ICRC for making this meeting happen tonight, and everyone on the land use committee. This is terrific.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks you guys for all volunteering. We appreciate it.
You'll get my bill in the morning, Kim.
Oh, gosh, Ralph.
Good night. Good night.
I want to propose a motion that we keep these meetings like this. This is great doing it from my own home. I mean, I never thought about that. Black again, man.
I'm still down here in Florida and it's 84 degrees, not a cloud in the sky. I'm not sure.
Oh,
what-
lucky dog.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Don't rub it in. Don't rub it in.
All right. Good night.
Take care, guys.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.